the Erisha. I'm your host, Erica Kang, and today, episode 48, we have Haseeb Qureshi, managing partner at Dragonfly Capital. Haseeb, it's been a long time. Well, we've been in Denver, but it's been a long time since we had a long conversation. So, welcome to the show. And could you please introduce yourself? Of course. You're much wanted on my behalf. I was, always wanting to have you on the show.
Well, thank you. I heard that this exciting place for Korean wannabes is the Erica shop. I'm kidding. Cool. Okay, so quick intro. So I'm Haseeb Qureshi. I'm a managing partner at Dragonfly Capital. Dragonfly is a global crypto fund. We invest all across the stack: early stage, late stage, mid stage, tokens, equity, and kind of everything under the sun. My background, so I used to be a software engineer and entrepreneur, and before that I was a professional poker player. So I have a number of different perspectives that inform my investment career.
Wow. Poker player. Oh my God. So, I mean, I think it's like a common factor, but there are so many poker players who are, who have this brilliant brain, right? I mean, they have a lot of strategy, under their hood. And I think they're into crypto a lot. Is that true? Is there a huge group of poker players?
It's definitely true that a lot of poker players found their way into crypto very early. A large part of the reason for this is that so in 2011, a lot of poker sites, especially ones that were targeting the US, got banned. And so a lot of poker players had to go overseas. And there was a growth of these poker sites that did serve US customers, but they couldn't use credit cards or bank transfers. And so they started using Bitcoin. And that was how a lot of poker players got turned on to crypto very early, because they had to use crypto in order to pay each other.
I see.
And the other element of it, I think, is that crypto and poker have a few things in common. People who ended up becoming really good poker players, they were people who weren't afraid of looking weird and making money in ways that other people would generally not approve of. So they're not afraid of looking strange and being early to things that most people think is subversive in a way. And poker was like that. And so is crypto. So I think that was what drew a lot of the same kinds of people to both poker and to crypto.
Same kinds of people. I totally understand. Yes. But it's a very understandable narrative. So yeah, I've seen so many poker players around me. So I'm just fascinated by that fact. Thanks for explaining that.
Well, poker players, they tend to make good traders. They don't tend to make good VCs. So I haven't noticed a lot of poker players becoming VCs, but trading is very common.
Well, you're investing.
I am investing. I think I'm the weird one. So I think a lot of people look at me and they're like, "Oh wow, you're a poker player. That must help you so much as a VC." I'm like, "No, not really. Pretty much all the poker players I know who are VCs are pretty bad."
So you're an outlier among the poker players.
I'm an outlier. I think I had to learn the skills that made me good at VC. I didn't get them from being a poker player.
Oh, I see. But you're an engineer too. So I think you had a very balanced career. I don't know, you have a very diverse career, right? Before you entered crypto.
That's true. Officially. Yeah. I have a lot of different perspectives.
Oh, very fascinating. What got you into crypto? Besides the poker player, that narrative, the Bitcoin narrative, but is there another reason that really got you hooked into crypto?
Yeah, so I started when I first got into crypto. I'd known about crypto for a long time. But, I bought my first Bitcoin in 2015, but it was 2017 when I first came into the space full time. And the story basically, so I was working as a software engineer at Airbnb, and Airbnb, it's a global company, so Airbnb pays people. It's a travel company, right? So you pay people in 60 plus countries around the world. And I'd never worked on payments before I joined Airbnb. When you use a product like Airbnb, you get this impression as a consumer that you swipe your credit card and then you magically, someone on the other side of the world gets paid and it's all seamless. And the reality, of course, is that there is no magical system that can instantly pay people on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
The reality is that there are many different systems that can pay people all around the world. Most of them don't really talk to each other, and they were all built 60 years ago. So they're all terrible. They're all super old and antiquated. And when you're an engineer and you see all the horrible spaghetti that lives on the back end of this software system, right? Where there's like CSVs that get emailed every midnight and reconciled by hand. And there's like places where you can't pay people in an automated way. And so, there's like a vendor who will mail a check to a PO box, and then they'll like hit your API when the check is picked up. And there's like all sorts of super janky stuff that is actually happening on the back end of a system like that. Mm-hmm. And as an engineer, when you see that, your instinct is, it's like, oh, this is terrible. We should throw all this away and we should start over with something that actually works for the world we live in today, which is global, which is digital first, which is real time, right? Yeah. And it clicked for me that, oh, that's what crypto is. Yeah. Crypto is a bunch of, software engineers and cryptographers and computer scientists and economists who got together and said, knowing everything we know today about peer-to-peer systems and cryptography and economics and monetary policy, how would you design a system of money differently? Mm-hmm. And each of these different cryptocurrencies was a different answer to this question. And that was what made me realize that like this stuff that's happening in crypto is going to change the world. Mm-hmm. There's just no way that the way we do money 50 years from now is going to be the way we did money 50 years ago. And crypto is going to have a role to play in how that happens. And that's what convinced me to get into crypto full time and leave the software world and join the fray.
Great story. Everyone has that story, right? And just
that's right.
The spaghetti, I really get that because I worked at a bank operations in the back end, and I saw how the Swift thing works, and I was like, whoa, this is all by hand, manual stuff.
That's right. It's extremely human driven. Extremely, and very inefficient. And I just felt the same thing like you did. So that's how I just like, okay, this is not going to happen in the modern world. So yeah, totally understand your story. Thanks for sharing that with us. And Dragonfly is definitely like becoming this cross-border, totally global fund, and I think it's doing enormously well. So congrats on that. You say it's becoming a cross-border fund.
It is. It is on the way of becoming like a mega fund.
Okay. Maybe someday we'll be a real fund.
My bad. But yeah.
No, you're good.
I'm very impressed on how you're really able to be truly cross-border, because like it's really, I think some funds aim to be, but it's hard to be, right? It's very hard. And I've seen your team members, and it's really just, really global. So I was very surprised by that. And you're also based in Taipei for a bit, right? And you're in Singapore right now. So what inspired you to become that kind of like cross-border, like global fund that you are right now? And how did the fund came to be? And I know Tom's involved as well, but just curious about that story as well. Right.
Yeah. So before I joined Dragonfly, I was originally at another fund called Metastable Capital. Yes. Which is one of the oldest funds in crypto. That fund was founded by Naval Ravikant in 2014. And when I was at Metastable, so Metastable was early in a ton of stuff, right? So when I was at Metastable, we did the seed round of Avalanche, seed round of Near Protocol, seed round of Starkware. We were in Filecoin and Algorand and blah blah blah. All these projects super early. Yeah. And in Metastable, we were a very technical fund, but we were also a very quintessential Silicon Valley fund. And one of the things about almost all the Silicon Valley funds is that when we saw a deal from Asia, it went straight from our desk into the trash can.
Really?
Because we just had no ability to underwrite it, and we had no willingness to underwrite it, right? Because as a Silicon Valley VC, we really loved this analogy, which we repeat to our LPs all the time, that crypto is going to be like the internet. Mm-hmm. And if crypto is going to be like the internet, then what that implies is that almost everything important is going to get built in Silicon Valley and then exported to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And the reality is that crypto is different, right? Within a week of the Bitcoin white paper being published on Slashdot, the white paper was translated into Chinese and Bitcoin started getting traded in China. And ever since then, the moment that a crypto project goes live, it has customers and users and community all over the world. Right, whether the founders know it or not. And it's really obvious when you zoom out and you look at crypto on a holistic basis that just to give you an example, most of the trading volume in crypto is not in the US.
Right.
It's not in the West. Most of it is in Asia. You know that very well. That's been true since 2017. It's still true today. When you look at the enterprise value in crypto, like just the value of all the companies in crypto, right? So like Coinbase right now is worth, slightly south of 40 billion. It's a great company, but Coinbase is, less than, it's like 5 to 10% of the global spot market.
Yeah.
And since 2018, crypto's been majority derivatives, not spot. And none of those derivatives are traded in the US. There's like a tiny amount traded in the CME. Almost everything in crypto is traded overseas in Asia. So, right now, by far the largest exchange in the world is Binance.
Yes.
Chinese founder, previously based in Singapore, although I guess they're now in Dubai. All the other big exchanges, OK, Huobi, Bybit, they're all based in Asia. And, if you look at and of course, the entire hardware industry, everywhere in the world, every single Bitcoin or Ether that's ever mined came from a machine that was created in Asia.
Yes.
And you take all those companies, you add them together, it's much larger than what's in the West. And the same thing is true in users, right? If you just look at exchange users, there's no contest. We know that there are many more users in Asia, many more wallets in Asia than there are in the West. And that's true whether you're looking on the exchange side or even if you look on chain, right? If you look at MetaMask users by country, the US is number 3. And we don't even know how many MetaMask users there are in China because they all have to use a VPN.
Yeah.
So the overall picture that you get is that not that crypto is about Asia, but rather crypto is a global phenomenon, right? Of course it's global. The whole point of crypto is that it's permissionless, borderless, decentralized, blah, 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 blah. And yet if you look at the Silicon Valley VCs, you wouldn't know it. They pretty much only invest into domestic US companies or protocols that are sourced in the US. And so that was the impetus behind us trying to build a different kind of fund. A fund that was global in nature and footprint. Now, a lot of the companies that we invest into are still in the US, right? So we invested into Anchorage, we invested into TaxBit, we invested into, in terms of protocols, things like, MakerDAO and Compound and DYDX and UMA. We invest also into Europe. We did like Dune Analytics, we did 1inch, we did, a bunch of other companies and protocols, of course. Near protocol, as you mentioned earlier, Avalanche, we invested in those out of Dragonfly as well. But we also have, we invested in 4 of the 5 unicorns that came out of Asia. So, we invested into Amber, Babel, Matrixport, into Bybit. So we've been early and active investors into both theaters, so to speak, in Asia and in the US. And it's fundamental to our philosophy at Dragonfly. So, as you mentioned, I spent a lot of my time in Asia. I also spent a lot of my time in the US. The big difference between the two worlds is that within the US or sort of the Anglophone market is where a lot of the protocols tend to come from.
Yes.
So, obviously, if you look through the top 20 on CoinMarketCap, almost all of those names are from the West.
Yes.
But if you look at the biggest companies, most of the biggest companies come from Asia. And so you see this dichotomy in where you tend to see the most value getting created in crypto. And I think over time we have seen the growth of more protocols in Asia, and we've also seen the growth of traditional companies in the US, obviously. But that tends to be the biggest difference between the two markets, is where the relative strengths are and what tends to be the most successful investments in the two spheres.
That's a good point. I think the same with Korea too. Like there's a ton of like exchanges coming out, of course, like they're updates, like becoming a mega giant in the Korean scene, but also protocols growing. But I think, as you said, the strength, like the strong platform is like the layer ones, as we so call it, were based in the US basically. So that, I mean, there are different types of strengths in both markets, but the fact that you're bridging those two markets and like you're seeing like more holistic way, I think that brings you more like an edge, as a fund too. So that's great.
I hope so. Yeah.
No, it's great that you're inclusive of what's happening in Asia and that you think that that's like really important. So yeah, that's a very good, like balanced. I mean, I think it comforts me too that you think that way, because my role is basically to bridge, Asia and non-Asia, right? It's East and West, so-called that we call it. So it's a constant battle, as you.
Well, that's why I came on. I wanted to ease your concerns about your own role. So
thank you.
I'm glad I could vindicate that for you.
Thank you. Yes. And I know you're like really busy, you're traveling a lot, but you've written a ton of stuff, a lot of good articles, and I've enjoyed a lot of them actually.
Most of them. Which ones did you not enjoy? Tell me, Erica, which ones did you not enjoy?
I put it in the wrong way. I enjoyed like the one about the cities the most. I think that was my favorite because it was like really intuitive for me because I'm a IR major. So like I think, you know, of companies as like countries. I think in a more like geopolitical way. I think like in more like nation states, that kind of like the actors, and like I just was trained to think that way. So the fact that you made that analogy was like really enlightening, at the same time very relatable. So a lot of people had questions about the article too, because I think the analogy always like puts questions too, like why did you put that analogy and like so forth. But for me it was, you know, just straightforward, but it was so easy to read too. So I really enjoyed that. And I mean, I think that article is like the top on the list. I think a lot of people.
I'm glad.
No, they really enjoy it, and it was a pretty long article. So can you maybe summarize like what your main message was there that you're trying to emphasize, and like what inspired you to think of, you know, blockchains as cities? There must have been some kind of motivation, right? Like that kind of.
Yes. Well, first thing is that the article is not that long. It's like a 5-minute read. So
sorry.
I would encourage your viewers to go read the article. There's also a tweet storm that's much shorter.
I'll share it.
So I'll give you the sort of the TLDR. So the impetus for writing the article is that you know, I've been chatting with a lot of folks who are very new into crypto, because I mean, I'm sure you've had the same experience that in the last year and a half there's been an enormous inflow of people who, you know, don't have the sense of history of what led to these, you know, they used to be called Ethereum killers, what led to these so-called Ethereum killers coming onto the stage. We don't use that term anymore. Right now we just call them, you know, alternative layer ones or whatever. The usual question that I would get is like, okay, is it going to be that like Solana is going to replace Ethereum and Ethereum's going to die and it's just going to be Solana that wins? Or do you think Ethereum's going to win, right? Like which of the two do you think is going to win? And if you've been in the space for long enough, like if you're sort of a, you know, an OG like yourself, then, you know, you look at that question, it's like, it like presupposes a certain model of how blockchains are going to interact with each other. And I think for most of us, like it's very intuitive that like, well, I mean, it actually seems like pretty stable that there would be multiple blockchains. And so I was thinking like, how can I explain this intuition that I have, why you should expect that actually multiple blockchains are likely to coexist. And that's where I came up with this cities analogy. And so very briefly, the analogy kind of works as follows. So when you imagine, usually when people describe blockchains, they call them networks. And if you call a blockchain a network, then what that implies is that they have network effects. And if a blockchain is a network effect, and it's a network in the sense that it's, you know, fully extensible, like the internet or like Facebook or something, and there's no cost to increasing the size of the network, then what you should expect is that there's going to be basically one network that wins, because the network effects are going to dominate, right? But blockchains are physically constrained. There's only so big that a blockchain can get because of the limits on decentralization. You cannot have an arbitrarily big blockchain. Otherwise, it won't be decentralized. It'll be too big for people to validate on their own computers. So that puts a physical constraint on the size of blockchains. They can't be arbitrarily big networks. And what is a network that is physically constrained by its size? One example of that is a city, right? You can have really big cities, and cities are kind of networks, but they can't be arbitrarily big. If you make a city too big, it kind of splinters off and becomes multiple cities, right? You just can't have a city that's like an entire country, right? It just doesn't work unless you're Singapore, in which case your country is the size of a tiny city. And so the idea is like, okay, if we think of blockchains as cities, what if we take this metaphor seriously? How would that help us understand the way that blockchains relate with each other? So think of Ethereum, right? Ethereum today it's extremely, it's the oldest blockchain. It's extremely expensive. It's very congested. But it's the most happening blockchain around, right? There's the most money there. There's the most innovative projects. There's the most NFTs. There's the most DAOs. You know, it's like a very it's a very vibrant place, but it's extremely expensive. Like the rent is crazy. What kind of city does that remind you of? Well, it reminds you of like New York, or Hong Kong, or Seoul, right? It's crazy expensive if you're young and you're, you know, in the early innings of your career. It's like it's insanely expensive for you to go settle down there. But look, if you're part of the rich and wealthy, if you're very influential, if you're just like, if you want to be near the center of all the most important stuff, right? Like, the biggest banks in Korea are going to be in Seoul, right?
Yeah.
The same way, like the biggest protocols in DeFi, they're going to be on Ethereum, right? Yeah, Ethereum's expensive, but look, if you're serious, you're going to go there, right? Because it's just where the most vibrant center of activity is. And so same thing with like, the most cultural moments, the biggest NFTs, they're all on Ethereum, right? The biggest celebrities, they're in New York, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So now not everyone can fit into Ethereum, right? It's just obvious that you can't get everyone who wants to be there into the city limits. And so how can you scale a blockchain the same way that you can scale a city? So one way, there are a few ways in which you can scale a city that correspond to blockchains. So the first one is if you don't have enough space in the city, you build up. You build skyscrapers, right? And de facto, if you look at Seoul, it's full of skyscrapers, right? There's like every single building goes vertical in Seoul. In the same way, in blockchains, one of the paths to scaling blockchains is what we now call layer 2. And layer 2 is kind of like a skyscraper. It's like a vertical blockchain that extends out of the underlying blockchain that has the security of that blockchain, but allows itself to scale vertically in a different direction than the rest of the blockchain's going. And so, a layer 2 it's kind of like, if you're in a skyscraper in Seoul, which I assume you might be, I don't know, I can't see out your window. But if you're in a skyscraper, like it's potentially a lot cheaper to be able to live in a skyscraper than to live on the ground floor. Like you go live in a house in Seoul, it's like insanely expensive.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
There's no way you can take a whole house. But if you live in a skyscraper, okay, things are much more affordable. Now the skyscraper is like kind of different than living directly in a house, like on street level in Seoul. But you're still in the city, right? The laws of the city still apply to you, even if you're in a skyscraper, but it's like kind of different, right? You're in air conditioned and then you've got a doorman and there's an elevator.
Yeah.
However, if you are in a skyscraper in Seoul and I am in a different skyscraper and you want to come hang out with me, right? Which I don't know why you'd want to do, but let's imagine that you would. You would have to go down your skyscraper, go take a taxi, get across town, fight traffic, get all the way to where I am, and then come visit me, right? And like in a roll-up, it's the exact same thing, right? If I'm in a roll-up and you're in a roll-up, but the roll-ups are different, then in order to get across town, we cannot escape the fundamental congestion of Ethereum, right? We still have to go down to L1 and pay L1 fees in order for us to interact with each other if we're not in the same roll-up. And so roll-ups are very similar in this way. If you think of roll-ups as similar to skyscrapers, then the answer of how you scale cities is that roll-ups or skyscrapers are an important part of how you scale cities. They will happen, but they are not the whole story, right? We did not just keep building skyscrapers and then at the end of it, everyone lived in Seoul. No. There were other things that had to happen for Korea to grow as a country, right? And so, okay, if you say that yes to skyscrapers, yes to layer 2, but it's not the only way that we're going to be able to scale these systems, what else are we going to need to do? So a second path to scaling is what I call these sort of like, farming towns or like small sort of settlements, so to speak, that only really do one thing. So you can imagine like a little, a set of factories over here, or like there's like a little NASA campus where like, NASA has like a small group of people who just do that. Or a bunch of outlet stores that are like kind of far out of the city center, right? And this is kind of analogous to application-specific blockchains. So this is like what Cosmos does or what Polkadot does, where they allow you to launch a little blockchain that only does one thing. And that one thing can be segregated from the rest of what's happening in the big city, right? So, one example of this, of course, is Axie Infinity. So Axie Infinity, they live on their own sidechain called the Ronin sidechain. And that segregates them from all the other noise that's happening on Ethereum, right? So like, look, we're gonna move outside the city center to just do our one thing, right? So it's like, it's like Disneyland or something. We're gonna go set up our own campus and we're gonna call it Disneyland. It's gonna be super fun. And like people will be willing to drive all the way out here because of how good our experience is, right? People will be willing to put up with that. And so, there are things like Disneyland and, like special campuses out in the middle of nowhere and factories and farmland and so on that are far away from cities. But they're not the lion's share of where economic activity happens, right? So again, it's like an and, not an or. This will happen, but it's not the primary way in which you're going to see blockchain scale. So the third path to scaling is the most obvious one, which is, okay, how do you scale a city when the city is full? The answer is that you build another city, right? So you can imagine, okay, if Ethereum is New York, then why don't you just go build LA and then go build Chicago and then go build Houston, right? And these different new layer ones, they really look a lot like they're starting new cities. So if you look at, something like Solana, right? When you start building Solana, what do you need to do when it all starts? Well, you need to first build a block explorer, which is kind of annoying because we already did that, but you got to do it again. You got to build a wallet. We already had a wallet on Ethereum, right? It's almost like when you start a new city, you got to rebuild a bunch of stuff. You got to build roads. And we already had roads. Why are we building roads?
Yeah.
You got to build infrastructure, right? You got to build a hospital. You got to build schools. You got to do this basic stuff before people can move in.
Yes.
Right? Then once you have that, at least once you have the basic infrastructure, then there are the basic businesses that have to exist, right? So when you start Solana, it's okay, we probably need an AMM because everyone loves AMMs, right? So we need an AMM. So Solana launches an AMM, right? So, okay, there's Radium. Radium's great. It's our AMM. It's like your McDonald's, right? You got to launch McDonald's when you start to say.
Yeah.
And then you got to get a Walmart, right? You got to get a Walmart in there. So that's your NFT marketplace or something, right?
Yeah.
So every platform, there are a few things like NFT marketplace, lending protocol, AMM, that are the kind of core businesses that we know people are going to want when they show up on a new blockchain. But the advantage of having a new city is that the new city, one, you start from scratch. So you got a bunch of real estate that people can move into for the first time, and it's much cheaper when you start a new city. But second is that cities are not carbon copies of each other. Right? Cities are all kind of different. Although New York and LA, they both have skyscrapers. They're both big cities. They both, whatever. They have some basic things in common. They're also culturally very different.
Yeah.
And you notice that with Solana and with Ethereum, right? Solana is very culturally different from Ethereum. Ethereum is all about decentralization and all about, the kind of core values of making, blockchain censorship resistant and nation state resistant and blah, blah, blah. Whereas Solana is no. We're the NASDAQ for blockchains. We're going to be super high performance. Yeah. All this decentralization babble nonsense. Who cares? The main thing is that you become super, super high performance and super cheap. Right. And it's the people in LA is there's people in New York. They've got, stick up their butts. Okay. They just appreciate, the good weather and everything's cheap and the food's great. And it's all about getting your 10 minutes of fame. And that difference in culture makes LA attractive to different industries and a different place that's worth living, right? And the best version of cities are cities that are actually very different from each other. So I don't know any other cities in Korea besides Seoul very well. So I can't do the analogy in Korea.
You'll visit Seoul sometime. There we go.
I know that.
Oh, you know Busan?
I know Busan. It's the only other one. I haven't been there. And then there was what was the city that shut down because of COVID very early?
Daegu.
Daegu.
Yeah. The hot area. It's very hot.
A hot area. Oh, I see. Got it. That's the only other one I know. So yeah. So those are that's my blockchains as cities analogy.
Wow, this is one of the most. I've been in the space since 2017, like yourself. But this is one of the most high quality 101 blockchain 101s I've ever heard. This is so intuitive. I can literally tell this to a lot of the newbies out there, and they'll be super enlightened. Right? I think this is great. I don't know,
Well, thank you. Me, I'm glad you feel that way.
No. Your jokes and everything. I really enjoyed it. I'll use that too. But yeah, thanks.
Sounds good.
Wow, this is great. I just forgot all my questions because I was so into
That's why it's important to write things down, Erica. That's why it's important to write things down.
So one question from Twitter, which I kind of gathered was they also loved your article about the analogy, and they were wondering what was the better way to invest? Most profitable investing in the cities itself or building on infrastructure that will be built in the cities. As an investor, what would you rate? How would you rate it?
Yeah, demonstrably, the best investments of crypto have historically all been layer ones, right? So if you look, probably the number one best investment in crypto history was Solana. And I think it arguably, according to some people who I've heard, it's maybe the best investment in venture history was Solana. I think it was 7,000x or something from inception, something like that. So it's pretty incredible. But just historically speaking, that has been the best investment in crypto. It's been in the layer ones. And if you take this analogy seriously, that, it kind of makes sense. If you imagine, okay, what are going to be the biggest sources of GDP in the US or in Korea, right? Is it going to be investing into a skyscraper developer? in Seoul, which would be like, layer 2, or would it be investing into, a bunch of things outside of Seoul, like the suburbs of Seoul or something like that? Or would it be investing into Busan? And it's very likely that like, no, like a huge amount of value gets created by starting a new city and having that huge network effect and all the people who come in and all the creativity and industries and blah, blah, blah that happens when you actually are a pioneer to create a new city. That it feels to me almost intuitive that would be the case. And it demonstrably, it does seem to be the case, right? Like if you sort of compare the market caps of the 3 approaches to scaling, the layer 1s are massive. Layer 1s are, almost everything in the top 10 is layer 1. The layer 2s, so not every layer 2, I mean, most layer 2s don't have tokens today. So, the biggest layer 2s like Arbitrum and Optimism and ZK Sync and Starkware, they don't have tokens. But you can see some of the, like you see Metis, obviously there's Polygon, which has a lot of layer 2s in the works that they have a token. And those tokens, they're valuable, but they're not, like none of them are in the top 10. And then if you look at the application-specific blockchains, right? So like probably the best, the application-specific blockchains that you see in the top 100, none of them are even in the top 20, right? So Atom sort of enables that. Polkadot kind of enables that, and so maybe there you could look at that as being an index on application-specific blockchains. But the actual application-specific blockchains themselves, like the things like Thorchain or things like Axie Infinity. Things like Osmosis. These are application-specific blockchains, and they're all pretty small. Like they're like 50 or lower, roughly on CoinMarketCap. And the biggest thing that's actually built on Cosmos SDK is Terra, which is not an application-specific blockchain, right? It's a generalized block. It's more like a city than it is like a little individualized farmland. And so which is almost again vindication of the idea that the cities are much more valuable than the application-specific blockchains, which are more like these, idiosyncratic sort of one-stop shops.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, as you mentioned about the Walmarts and like the basic Whole Foods that need to be built on every city, right? The infrastructure. I think just that itself, it expands so much and it just incorporates so many players out there. So I think like that just itself is a huge investment. And so totally agree. Thanks for the whole story. It was so enlightening. And there was another recent article on the comparing the layer 1 performances. I really love how you really have those like kind of spicy articles. And it reminds
spicy benchmarking.
No. I mean, yeah, exactly. You mentioned in the article, about the TPS days where we were like comparing that was like the hype line, right? Where like, oh, we have like that much TPS, and you kind of rebutted against that and said this is the better way to do it. Can you explain like on the recent method? I mean, that you kind of incorporated in your analysis and like why you thought was the best way for the measurement? Because I think that's a really good basis for like kind of comparing the layer 1s out there. So yeah, can you explain a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I know you remember the days when these quote unquote Ethereum killers were initially pitching to the investors. And back then, right, like you'd see in the pitch decks, right, it's like, okay, I'm 3,000 TPS, I'm 5,000 TPS, I'm 11,000 TPS. And I was recently looking at a memo that I wrote when I was looking at the seed round for Solana, which is the most painful memo I've ever written. Because we passed on the seed round of Solana. And in that deck, in the seed round deck of Solana, because I have my notes on the deck, it says that Solana can do 720,000 TPS, which it's basically almost 1 million transactions per second, which is like, to be clear, that's more than what Google does in transactions per second. So it's like a crazy number. Yeah. And so there was this game almost of like trying to one up all these ridiculous numbers that other people were posting. And, there's a kind of innocuousness of like, okay, people are sort of chest thumping and they're kind of showing how cool they are and how great they are and how exciting their technology is, which is, you can imagine it being kind of harmless. But there are also ways in which I noticed that entrepreneurs started becoming very confused about what these blockchains actually could do, right? I remember like getting pitches from entrepreneurs who were building on Solana who were telling me like, yeah, I'm building this like first-person shooter play to earn game, and every time someone shoots the gun, it's going to like write a transaction on Solana. And I'm like, I don't think that is possible. Like Solana will die if you try to do that. And he's like, well, no. Solana can do 50,000 TPS. So it's fine. Like that's, there's no problem. And I realized okay, this is really kind of seeped so far into people's psyches that they don't understand that these numbers, like the benchmarking that all the layer ones put out for themselves, is basically all bullshit. And so why is it bullshit, right? Like why is it that these numbers are not reflective of reality? So there are a few reasons why, and this kind of goes to the essence of software and hardware benchmarking. So usually when protocols release their own numbers about what their performance numbers are, they try to find the best possible way that they can get a big number. And so, okay, what's your transaction if you're in your TPS stands for transactions per second? What are you counting as a transaction and how are you measuring it, right? And so usually what these projects will do is the transaction will be a simple send. So the simplest possible transaction, which is just like sending, tokens from one address to another. And they'll do it not on mainnet, but usually in like a testnet or in a devnet, which is much more centralized than the mainnet is going to be. And it's oftentimes not even running over the public internet. So sometimes those will be, devnets that are running like over a LAN inside a data center, right? And that's where they're getting 50,000 TPS or 5,000 or 3,000 or whatever. And so these numbers are just not reflective of reality. They have nothing to do with what this network can do at mainnet. And second, most transaction throughput that actually chews up, compute on these networks is not transfers, right? If you look on Ethereum, how much of what people is doing is just transferring Ether back and forth? No, they're buying NFTs, they're trading on Uniswap, they're like doing all this complex stuff. So the question is, that's what you and I think of as a transaction, right? Not like, okay, Erica, I'm going to send you ETH, you send me ETH, and we just do all day. That's not what people are doing. So, what is a good measurement of the real throughput of these things, right? In most, in hardware or in, software, usually you have these third-party organizations, these like neutral organizations that go in and they publish benchmarks to actually measure as third parties, how fast is like the latest AMD chip versus the latest Intel chip, right? Or how fast is the latest NVIDIA, graphics card versus the AMD graphics card or whatever. And there's nothing like that in crypto. And we were like, why not? Why isn't there any external benchmark? And so we're like, okay, why don't we try to make one ourselves? So that was the impetus for the post is like, okay, why don't we just try to come up with an external benchmark and show people these are the real numbers that you would get if you actually ran like an honest benchmark. And so the benchmark that we came up with was very simple, which is that if you try to max out trades on an AMM like Uniswap, you just trade back and forth in one pool on one AMM, how many trades per second can this blockchain do until it's totally full? That was the test. It's a very simple test, right? Very fair test because, Uniswap historically has been the biggest gas guzzler on Ethereum. So what most people are doing on Ethereum is actually taking up gas. And, when Solana falls over, so, famously when Solana went down for several days, it was because of an IDO that was taking place. People were trading on an AMM and the blockchain fell over because of too much demand. So this is usually when things spike on blockchains is because of AMMs. So, okay, let's measure how many AMM trades per second can these blockchains do? And the answer was, I'm going from memory, but basically it was something like, Ethereum can do about 10, Celo can do about 25, Avalanche on average can do about 35 or so, but at max they can do like 150 or something like that. Binance Smart Chain, Polygon can do about 90, and then Binance Smart Chain can do about 180. And those are all EVM chains. They all use EVM, same architecture as Ethereum, right? Now compare Solana to that. How much can Solana do in terms of transactions per second on AMM? And you would think the answer would be in thousands, maybe in the tens of thousands. The answer is that Solana can do about 270, which is more than everything on everything prior, but it's not 5 times more. It's not even 2 times more, right? It's like, it's significantly more. So now the interesting thing about running this experiment, the interesting takeaway is that one, the spread between what blockchains can do in terms of their performance is much less than advertised, right? So people claim that, oh, my next gen blockchain can do like thousands of times the throughput of Ethereum. And that's not really true. There's nobody who can do thousands of times the throughput of Ethereum. People can do like maybe 20, 30x what Ethereum can do. They can't do 100x, and they certainly can't do 1,000x. And the reality is that we're just not getting that much performance out of a virtualized, a linearized virtual machine today. Eventually we will. I think there's a lot more optimizations that can be done, but today we're not getting it, right? And that's just a fact. And I think there are a lot of broader implications for understanding where we are at in terms of the overall development of these layer ones, right? Like if you think these layer ones can do thousands of TPS, then maybe you think like, okay, we're done, right? These are
Yeah.
the last version of any of these things. It's like, we've entered into the last era of blockchains, and like now we finally got the final blockchains we're ever going to need. And but if you realize like, look, all these things are still really janky, the performance is still not that great, then you realize like, look, we exited, Ethereum being like the MS-DOS era of crypto, but we've entered the Windows 95 era of crypto, right?
Yeah.
Where things are better, but it's not ready for mass adoption. We can't have millions or tens of millions of people using these blockchains if you're only getting a couple hundred TPS at best for these chains. And so that was the overall takeaway of the article. And actually, I just very recently, as of the time that we're having this conversation, I just had a Twitter Spaces today with Anatoly from Solana, because when we published this, of course, like Solana was like, "Yo, what the hell?" Like blah blah blah, and so they were challenging a lot I think he was very gracious about it, and so we kind of hashed it out through this conversation, and so I think they're very friendly and understanding of what we were trying to do. And it's also true that the way that we measure performance, it doesn't allow the parallelism of Solana to really shine, right? So Solana, in principle, can do 4 times the number that we stated, which is something about 1,000 transactions per second, but it can only do them across different AMMs. Yeah. If it's all happening on one AMM, Solana is bottlenecked at 270 transactions per second. But if there are different AMMs that are happening, then you can do it in multiple places. But that's also true in Ethereum 2.0, because Ethereum 2.0 is sharded, so you can have multiple shards doing this simultaneously. Same with Near, same with other blockchains that have the ability to separate out state into separate chains. But so Solana does that all within one chain. But there are other blockchains that can do it across multiple chains as well. So it's not apples to apples, but it's also true that Solana also has other abilities that our benchmark did not elicit. But when Solana did fall over, it was because of this constraint, because it was all people. When blockchains go crazy, it's everyone trying to compete with to get one IDO or one everyone's trying to get on OpenSea, or everyone's trying to get on this one thing that is ultimately going to bottleneck the state in one place. So that was the takeaway of the article.
Oh, that's also a very pressing point. Issue for years to come. Now it's pretty premature and we're just getting started. But then I think you mentioned in the article that the reason why we don't notice this is because we don't need to notice about it, because it's not even in full capacity as of yet. Yep. So when we really reach that point, like what's it going to be in the future? So I think relating to this argument, I think we can kind of predict what's going to happen. Well, this year, nothing like huge might happen, like monumental in terms of hitting that capacity. But I don't know what you think about that. But what do you expect will happen like in the latter half of this year, and also like in the next 5 years or so? I think your articles really they reflect like a future, like what we can predict the future out of your articles. But in your perspective, like what is bound to happen, and what is like, I guess, a pressing concern on your end as well? Positive and negative, maybe you can kind of point out both, points. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think probably one of the big catalysts that's going to drive a lot of users into crypto is gaming. Right now, gaming in crypto is still pretty small, right? Like all the crypto games, by the standards of games, don't have that many users. Right. There are games that have hundreds of millions of users, and there's nothing in crypto that is at that scale yet. So I do think that as crypto gaming grows and becomes more mature, that's going to bring a lot of people into the space and start contending a lot more for block space than the contention that we have today. At the same time, it's also true that these blockchains are going to evolve as that's happening, right? So like Solana, Avalanche, Near, Polygon, these blockchains are all very young. They haven't existed nearly as long as Ethereum, and they're going to continue to innovate. They're going to continue to change their designs in order to kind of keep at the cutting edge of what's possible within blockchain technology. And I think it's to the earlier analogy about blockchains of cities. It's very likely that all of them are going to invest eventually into skyscrapers, right? They're all eventually going to have their own layer 2s. Yes. And as they scale, probably what you'll see is a similar trajectory to what Ethereum has had to do to scale, which is that they will start using a multitude of ways to scale themselves as demand on these chains starts really growing, right? So in some sense, I'm not worried in the short term. But it's very clear in the long term. Like, look, whatever architecture we come up with in the long term has to be able to sustain, millions and millions of users more than what we have today. And the only real way to get there is to massively improve our scaling technologies. And so, sharding, I think, is one of those important ways that can really scale blockchains far beyond what they are today. In principle, the same thing is true for Solana. Solana is a very, very scalable architecture, provided that you're comfortable with the entirety of Solana being, fitting on one machine effectively in principle. We're big investors into, Avalanche and Near, as well, other blockchain. We're also investors in Cosmos and Mina and Celo and a bunch of others. And they're all taking different approaches toward how to scale blockchains for the next million or tens of millions of users. But the reality, of course, is that we don't have those tens of millions of users yet today. So it's right now still in the, we still have the luxury of time to figure out different strategies and to also try a lot of different strategies, right? And so in a way, de facto, we're seeing, kind of 1,000 flowers bloom, where you have, Near is trying to take on sharding, Solana is trying to take on vertical scaling. You've got, Avalanche is trying to do subnets, which are almost like, in a way, application-specific blockchains. So you have many different approaches toward trying to get to the same end result.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited about what will, come in the near future. Also in the next 5 years or even 10 years. I guess we're in here for good, in this space for good. So hopefully,
I think you and I are. You and I are not employable anymore by TradFi, unfortunately.
I know, I'm not getting any of those, those offers anymore. I'm just kind of here in my own brand, and which is good and bad, right? But it's great that people like you have such great insight, and we can learn from you, and we can also be inspired by each other. It's really great to have you. We need a second round, part 2 for this, to be honest. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights. And I really hope to have you again on board onto the show, because I think it was very insightful for me personally too. So yeah, thank you so much. Any last words for the Korean community? If you have any anything to share with them.
Last words of the Korean community, I would say keep following Erica. She's amazing. She's a great she's a great leader for the Korean community. I hope to see you guys out in the metaverse.
Oh, and the gaming industry will definitely bloom in Korea. So I think you should really look out for that. And please visit Korea at some point. I'm holding Battle Asia in August, so I'll invite you to that.
I would love to come by. I'd love to come by.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Haseeb.
Amazing. Thanks, Erica.